unanswered. And just as the Syrian regime's use of chemical weapons last weekend was not an isolated incident, our response is part of a new course chartered last year to deter future use of chemical weapons. Our Syrian strategy has not changed. However, the Syrian regime has forced us to take action based on their repeated use of chemical weapons. Since the April 2017 chemical attack at Khan Sheikhoun, the United States has imposed hundreds of sanctions on individuals and entities involved in chemical weapons use in Syria and North Korea. We have designated entities in Asia, the Middle East, and Africa that have facilitated chemical weapons proliferation. We have revoked the visas of Russian intelligence officers in response to the chemical attack in Salisbury. We will continue to seek out and call out anyone who uses and anyone who aids in the use of chemical weapons. With yesterday's military action, our message was crystal clear. The United States of America will not allow the Assad regime to continue to use chemical weapons. Last night, we obliterated the major research facility that it used to assemble weapons of mass murder. I spoke to the president this morning, and he said if the Syrian regime uses this poisonous gas again, the United States is locked and loaded. When our president draws a red line, our president enforces the red line. The United States is deeply grateful to the United Kingdom and France for its part in the coalition to defend the prohibition of chemical weapons. We worked in lockstep. We were in complete agreement. Last night, our great friends and indispensable allies shouldered a burden that benefits all of us. The civilized world owes them its thanks. In the months to come, the Security Council should take time to reflect on its role in defending the international rule of law. The Security Council has failed in its duty to hold those who use chemical weapons to account. That failure is largely due to Russian obstruction. We call on Russia to take a hard look at the company it keeps and live up to its responsibilities as a permanent member of the Council and defend the actual principles the United Nations was meant to promote. Last night, we successfully hit the heart of Syria's chemical weapons enterprise. And because of these actions, we are confident we have crippled Syria's chemical weapons program. We are prepared to sustain this pressure if the Syrian regime is foolish enough to test our will. Thank you.
All right, that was UN Ambassador Nikki Haley in front of the United Nations rebuking Syria for its use of chemical weapons against its own people. And I want to go back to Congresswoman Barbara Lee. I counted 5 separate instances of Nikki Haley making pretty tough statements about Russia, somebody that Donald Trump has up until this point been very loath to say a cross word about. She started out early in her statement by saying we can all see that a Russian disinformation campaign is in full force this morning, but Russia's desperate attempts at deflection cannot change the facts. Number 2, she claims we did not just give diplomacy just one chance, we gave it 6 chances. That's how many times Russia vetoed Security Council resolutions to address chemical weapons. That's number 2. Third time, President Putin said Russia would guarantee that Syria complied with not using chemical weapons. We hope this diplomacy would succeed in putting an end to the horror of chemical attacks in Syria. We see from this past that did not happen. This past year did not happen. While Russia was busy protecting the regime, Assad took notice. It knew it could act with impunity. She then later on says we cannot stand by and let Russia every international norm that we stand for and allow the use of chemical weapons to go unanswered. 2 more. She then adds the Security Council. She attacks the Security Council as well and says the Security Council failed in its duty to hold those who use chemical weapons to account, and follows that by saying that failure is largely due to Russian obstruction. And lastly, we call on Russia to take a hard look at the company it keeps and live up to its responsibilities as a permanent member of the Security Council and defend the actual principles the United Nations is meant to promote. That's a lot of Russia bashing, Congresswoman, from a woman who is a part of an administration that has been nothing if not solicitous, some might say obsequious, toward Vladimir Putin's Russia. What do you make of that?
Well, first, I would hope that the president pushes back on Russia as it relates to interference in our domestic affairs, especially with our elections. Secondly, I want to remind everyone that last year the United States conducted what we called precision and surgical strikes because of the issue around Assad using chemical weapons against his own people. Here we are a year later. We need an international strategy. We need a plan. We need a diplomatic initiative. We need to hold Assad accountable. He's a war criminal, and bring him before the international court. Until we do that, we'll be back again next year with these same talking points, with the same reaction, because I want to remind you again, every action will trigger a reaction. And so this is very dangerous. We need to come up with a plan and a strategy, and we need to make this administration come to Congress to debate the cost and consequences of their military actions, not only in Syria, but throughout the world.
You know, John, I'm old enough to remember when people on the right and on the left said that Donald Trump would be less dangerous to the world than Hillary Clinton because she might start World War III and that she might want to start a war with Russia, including that. You now have any escalation against Syria risks hitting Russian fighters who are on the ground in Syria supporting the regime, or Iranian fighters who are also, you know, Iran is also the other big backer of the Syrian regime. This is pretty escalatory rhetoric by Nikki Haley. It's never clear if she is speaking directly for Donald Trump, because that's just never clear for anyone in the administration. But what do you make of these 5, at least, pointed references to the Putin regime by Ambassador Haley?
I don't have a problem with her addressing the Russia issue. I think it's about time that this administration stood up to Russia. So I don't have an issue with that. But as a U.S. taxpayer, I was pretty embarrassed by that speech, and I was embarrassed for Nikki Haley. Since when does the United States of America decide that we can legislate the tactics people use to kill people? It misses the entire point. The entire point isn't just that chemical weapons were used in Syria. The entire point is, since we invaded Iraq in 2003, it unleashed warfare across the region where millions of Syrian civilians have died, and fighters. So the larger question for the United States going forward is, how do we prevent killing in Syria? Not just, oh, you can't gas people. How do we prevent the war? At what time do we sit down and say, let's bring the leaders of these countries together and let's have a conference about the future of Syria, and not how you're going to kill people?
Yeah, you know, I cannot escape the irony, Congresswoman Lee, that the sort of original, the sort of origin of much of this unrest, the Al-Qaeda in Iraq that didn't exist before, this insurgency, the Sunni insurgency that happened because we invaded Iraq, that's now embedded. ISIS is, you know, calls themselves the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. In Iraq and Syria, that's the other I in ISIS. And that we haven't addressed that. We haven't corrected that we seem to be doubling down. And Donald Trump, of all people, is the newest neocon on the block. What, I mean, are you as sort of discombobulated by that reality as I am?
George, there's no solutions to the world's problems. When you look at the fact that we've been in Afghanistan now 17 years, we're still in Iraq. Now we're in Yemen. We've conducted strikes in Somalia. We've conducted strikes in Libya. The Congressional Research Service has provided me a declassified report showing that we've used the 9/11/2001 authorization to use force 41 times, mind you, throughout the world. And that's why the country needs to demand that Congress do its job and debate the costs and consequences of these wars, because this is a state of perpetual war. And I know that this administration, in its with John Bolton there now, their military first tendencies and policies could lead into more danger and to more violence and to more wars. We need a diplomatic solution to all of the world's problems. We need political settlements, and we always have the military option on the table. But world without war is what we need to try to achieve, and we're going in the opposite direction, and it's very dangerous and it's very tragic.
Yeah, and John, as a representative of those who actually have to put their bodies on the line to do the fighting, does it worry you that there are now people, particularly principally running the National Security Council, who do believe that there is a military solution to the mess in Syria?
Yeah, I think Bolton's a concern, not just from what he said about Syria, but what he's, wrote in the Wall Street Journal about intervention against North Korea. So I think that is a concern that more neocons have come in and that Trump's gone full neocon in the past couple weeks, even yesterday pardoning a neocon. But Secretary Mattis has a tremendous amount of respect inside the military. He is